Mary Simmons, like her husband Chris, was born and raised in Oregon. From an early age, the girl was used to the pristine beauty of her native land, which was buried in dense forest and was considered one of the most beautiful places in the southwestern United States. Mary and Chris lived in a small house located at the very edge of the forest. The young people loved each other very much and had been married for 3 years. However, Mary couldn't get pregnant for quite a while, which didn't only upset the woman, but also her husband. But when Chris found out that his wife was finally pregnant, his happiness knew no bounds. The man was ready to carry Mary in his arms in the truest sense of the word, only to make sure everything was all right with his baby. Time seemed to fly by, and when the woman was 8 months pregnant, she started feeling great excitement and a barely perceptible inner anxiety. The situation was complicated by the fact that Chris had to go on business trips often. They were an integral part of his work. And that was exactly what happened this time. Despite the approaching due date, Chris had to travel many miles west in order to make a lucrative deal for the company in which he worked. Chris was very worried about his wife, and therefore he called his parents and asked them to come over and help Mary in case some unforeseen situation happened. But despite the love and care of her husband, Mary refused the help she was offered because she was feeling fine at the time. "Thank you, dear. I really appreciate your concern, but I'd rather be alone," the woman said when Chris called her upon arriving at his destination. Of course, in the depths of his soul, the man believed that taking extra precautions wouldn't hurt, but he didn't voice his concerns and agreed with his wife. Chris loved his wife very much and didn't want to upset her with his disturbing doubts. By the irony of fate, after the man's departure, a terrible blizzard hit the area, covering everything around with a white, fluffy blanket. The hurricane that broke out at night didn't only cause snowdrifts on the road, but even uprooted several trees. But the worst part was that the snowstorm damaged the cell tower, leaving a good half of the state without mobile coverage. Maybe it was the bad weather, or the consequences it causes, but Mary started feeling extremely uncomfortable after the blizzard. "God, that's not what I'm thinking about, is it? I still have a week before my due date," Mary whispered, rubbing her belly, which was throbbing from a sharp pain. On the other hand, the woman realized that she couldn't wait any longer and that she needed to quickly get to the hospital. It was located a few miles away from their house, lost in the wilderness. Therefore, Mary didn't hesitate long and made the decision to get to the hospital herself. Throwing a change of clothes into her bag, the woman took the keys to her old Chevrolet and went outside. She was surprised to see that there was much more than snow than it seemed at first glance. Barely managing to clear the snow off the windshield, Mary got behind the wheel and resolutely turned the key in the ignition. Unfortunately, given the situation, the woman didn't see that the fuel tank was almost empty. Mary only noticed the flashing light indicating the crucial fuel level when it was already too late. Well, whatever happens, happens, the woman thought and hit the gas. The engine roared and the Chevy rushed forward, cutting through the untouched snow like a knife through butter. But despite all her best efforts and positive thinking, Mary only managed to drive for about 2 miles, after which the car stopped on a snow-covered road, as if rooted into the ground. The woman realized that her chances of coming across someone who could give her a lift were minuscule. Who would willingly leave their cozy warm house in such a blizzard? Only a woman in labor whose contractions are getting stronger by the minute. Mary thought ironically, not taking her eyes off the deserted snow-covered road. At that moment, the woman felt a sharp pain in her lower abdomen, signaling that she was running out of time. Given the situation, Mary decided it would be best to get out of the warm car and try walking along the highway, hoping that someone would drive by. A sharp gust of wind, mixed with prickly snow, instantly cooled Mary's flushed face. The woman had no doubts left. She was in labor. Having a tough time moving her legs, which now felt as if they didn't even belong to her, Mary walked down the snow-covered road, praying that she'd be able to get to the hospital. Suddenly, Mary's attention was drawn to several gray shadows that appeared on the road a few dozen feet away. Good Lord, those must be wolves. A terrifying thought flashed through the woman's head. As if to confirm her guess, the gray shadows suddenly growled and their eyes lit up. There were at least a dozen wolves, and they all looked at the lonely traveler with undisguised malice and disapproval. With a frightened cry, Mary tried to run off the road, and falling into the knee-deep snow, hurried to the nearest grove. The woman hoped that the wolves wouldn't understand what she was trying to do and would simply go on their way. Unfortunately, Mary only managed to take about a dozen steps before she felt that it was time for her to give birth. The woman leaned back against the nearest spruce and groaned softly. Feeling terrible pain in her lower abdomen, Mary asked God for only one thing. God, please make sure my baby survives. She kept repeating with tears in her eyes. Meanwhile, a large she-wolf stepped out of the pack and headed straight for Mary. She was a large and confident predator who'd seen many successful hunts and glorious, exciting fights in her lifetime. The she-wolf's pack respected and trusted her, which once again proved her high status. Unfortunately, the predator never experienced the joys of motherhood. She had a rare genetic anomaly that made her infertile. Therefore, when her nostrils caught a strange, exciting smell, she stopped and carefully looked at the woman in labor lying in front of her. The she-wolf wasn't familiar with this smell, but for some unknown reason, she found it very disturbing and agitating. The predator was quickly followed by the rest of the pack. Now they all stood around the unfortunate woman. Mary was screaming loudly because of fear and pain, trying not to look into the green eyes of the gray killers. To the woman's great surprise, the she-wolf sniffed her hand and then threw her head back and howled loudly, looking at the sky. As if following the order of their leader, the gray predators surrounded Mary, forming a live wall around her, thus shielding her from the piercing wind. The woman was terrified, but she gathered up all her strength, and soon a tiny pink baby was already lying next to her. The gray predator came closer and carefully gnawed the umbilical cord that connected the baby with its mother, weakened by giving birth. With tears in her eyes, Mary reached out and picked up her crying baby. As she did, the woman's hand accidentally touched the furry head of the predator, who was surprisingly meek and submissive. At some point, Mary felt that she no longer had anything to fear, since she was already in a snowy forest teeming with gray predators. It just can't get any worse, the woman thought, hugging the tiny baby. At that moment, the wolf came closer and pushed her nose into the woman's hand, as if encouraging her in a kind of silent support. Mary carefully looked into the predator's eyes and saw that they radiated goodness and didn't burn with malice or anger. "Thank you, Mother Wolf," the woman muttered through tears. She was touched to the depths of her soul by what this forest predator did. But what the she-wolf did next surprised Mary so much that she simply couldn't hold back her tears. The she-wolf came close to the new mother, lying on the snow, and pressed against her with her whole furry body. Falling into a deep sleep, Mary felt the warmth emanating from the predator, which kept her warm through the night. Fortunately, the weather was much better in the morning, as the sun rose over Oregon. The bright rays woke up the sleeping Mary, who was holding her tiny baby to her chest. At that moment, the young mother heard some agitated voices nearby, which seemed very familiar. As it turned out, the voices belonged to Chris's parents, who were worried about their daughter-in-law and came to her house as soon as the snowstorm subsided. Along the way, the elderly couple came across Mary's car, parked by the side of the road. Imagine the surprise of the Simpsons when Mary came out to greet them, holding her newborn baby in her arms. At the sight of the strangers, the wolf pack ran away and carefully watched what was happening from 100 feet away. "God, this is just incredible," whispered Amanda Simpson, having a hard time holding back her tears. And the she-wolf gave Mary a long farewell look before leading her pack into the depths of the forest, where there were great places for hunting and no humans. Chris's parents hugged their daughter-in-law, thanking God that she was so fortunate to have survived such a terrible blizzard. And only Mary, holding tight to her baby, knew that she wouldn't have survived if it weren't for the gray she-wolf, who showed mercy and didn't let her and the baby freeze to death. After all that she'd been through, Mary was very weak. Mr. Simpson picked her up and carried her to his car on the side of the road. Meanwhile, nodding her head to the sound of the man's steps, Mary looked after the wolf pack, which disappeared into the forest thickets like a ghostly haze. The woman couldn't help but feel happy. She became a mother and experienced a truly unforgettable night. She had no doubt that she'd be telling this story over and over again, sitting by a warm fireplace with her children, grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren,